Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for the invitation to join the symposium today, which is a great tribute to the wonderful work of the project and the team, as we've already been hearing about. What I want to present to you, I hope, is something of a case study in what Estelle was speaking about a little earlier, which is what we can discover when at last the research community can encounter manuscripts in their entirety. The Book of St Albans, as it's long been known, Trinity College Manuscript 177, has for 100 years been accessible to the research community largely through that grainy black and white photograph sequence in M.R. James's Lowes and Jacobs publication from the 1920s. Great if you can track down a copy, or even better if you can make the journey here to Dublin. But otherwise, not a great point of entry into a remarkable manuscript. And above all, it only tells us about the images. And wonderful as they are, what I want to suggest to you today is that there is more to that remarkable manuscript than those images. There are the texts also, particularly the texts in the largely overlooked leaves that lie at the end of the manuscript. And I'm in fact going to get close up to just 10 leaves at the end of that manuscript, which I'd like to suggest might begin to offer us a new understanding of the manuscript as a whole, the Book of St Albans as a whole and its place in that great Benedictine Abbey in southern England, but also the place of that book in Matthew Paris's own career. And we wouldn't know about those leaves, we wouldn't be able to study them closely without the digitisation of the whole manuscript. For those of you who can just about make out the image behind the text on my title slide, this is in fact an attempt to return Manuscript 177 to its original context, and that is the shrine context at St Albans Abbey. But not in fact the shrine of St Alban, the patron saint of the Abbey, but the shrine of his co-martyr and in effect co-patron of that great abbey, St Amphibolus. And the shrine of the co-martyr has recently been recreated painstakingly by the present church community at St Albans Abbey Church, and there you find it. And this manuscript must be understood almost as I've presented it here, standing alongside this shrine. And the final 10 leaves of the manuscript tell us why. But first, I think there's no doubt that almost from the moment that the first of Matthew Paris's surviving manuscripts left St Albans Abbey, and they began to leave it in the last decades of the 15th century, almost half a century before the dissolution of the monastery, viewers of those manuscripts have wondered at the inspiration for such remarkable creativity from the hands of one individual Benedictine monk. And it seems to me that the weight of opinion for explaining Matthew's creativity has always come down on his relationship with the outside world. That it was Matthew's encounters with kingship, his understanding of reports of conflicts across Christendom and on its borders in the Crusade, and his awareness of the whole caravan of society passing outside of the precinct of the Abbey, that really inspired his feats of artistry and literary exposition. But arguably, that is an explanation of Matthew's creativity that has been founded on those parts of Matthew's remarkable work which have been accessible to us in the analogue age of research. That is, representations of those manuscript illustrations, reproduced as in the original facsimile of the Book of St Albans in black and white, and then more recently in various other research publications. Arguably, though, that has skewed our understanding of what fired Matthew's inspiration. Yes, he illustrated what he learned of and met with in the secular world as a monk, but was that really the source of his inspiration? If we shift our attention from Matthew's imagery to Matthew's texts, Matthew's writings, and the entirety of those writings, which so often, I think, until we can encounter whole manuscripts in digitised form, have tended to be separated from his images. There is a cohort of scholars who work on the images. Many of them are looking at me now. And there are scholars who work on his texts, but we tend to inhabit different worlds. If we do shift from image to text, we trace a line of sight actually back away from the secular world and back into the precinct of his monastery and into his abbey church itself, and to the routine rituals of the abbey church, which provided the frame through which Matthew, in many ways, encountered that outside world. He is a writer wholly anchored by the monastic office, performed day and night in the abbey church, and animated in particular by the principal festivals of that observant life inside the abbey church, and especially the festivals associated with the relics that were curated by his monastic community. I'd like to suggest that we need to refocus our understanding of Matthew and his creative output in relation to his encounter with the power of the relics of saints. If we do trace his outlook through his writings, what we find is a writer who is increasingly excited by the potential of those relics that he and his community create to generate almost a raw spiritual power. Perhaps the most important moment in Matthew's creative life, I'd like to suggest this afternoon, is the moment on the 13th of October 1247, where he stands alongside King Henry III to witness the arrival of the Holy Blood relic at Westminster Abbey. He watches it with the king, and indeed this is the moment, as far as we can tell, that Matthew the monk first engages directly in conversation with his monarch. The monarch asks him, what does he think of this spectacle? And Matthew is fulsome in his response, that it has stirred his heart extraordinarily. It seems to give rise in Matthew, if we trace through his own historical writings, a new way of seeing his world, his church world, and its relationship with the outside world. He begins to record much more assiduously, much more extensively, the world's celebration of powerful relics. In 1253, he starts to record the performance of relics kept at Chichester Cathedral and Lincoln Cathedral. He even goes so far as to say, asking in his chronicle text, are we at the dawn of a new age? It would seem as if the age of the early fathers is upon us again, where the most wonderful miracles are performed in the world. And there's a sort of quickening enthusiasm as we reach the final leaves of Matthew's chronicle. Matthew, we think, dies sometime in 1259. This is an aging monk who is increasingly focused on the power of relics. He's back telling us about Chichester and Lincoln in 1255, and then in what is perhaps the final 18 months of Matthew's life, 21st of January 1257, St Agnes's Day, and he is excited by the performance of a miracle that he witnesses himself at St Albans Abbey itself, a cure miracle which he reports at great length. Now, if Matthew's inspiration is rooted in a monastic community's curation of its relics and it's growing in the course of his life, perhaps we could say it is initially sparked by that extraordinary moment in October 1247. But in fact, maybe not. Maybe this has always been a part of Matthew's life. Because we also find in his writings that on the 14th of May 1220, Abbot William of Trumpington, the Abbot of St Albans, translates the relics of Albans co-martyr Amphibolus to a new shrine at the heart of the church. And Matthew describes it. Now, it's a significant date because this is happening when Matthew Paris is a novice. This is at the very beginning of Matthew's life. Matthew tells us himself that he entered the religious life as a Benedictine in 1219. By the 14th of May 1220, he must still be a novice. He is a very young religious at the very beginning of his career. At least 15 years before, as far as we can tell, he puts pen to parchment and begins his writing life, his creative life. So in other words, in fact, Matthew's inspiration that he draws from the curation of relics and the performance that is, after all, at the centre of the monastic life and the place of the monastic church in wider society, is in fact something that is threaded throughout Matthew's life. Without that entry that we have from the 14th of May 1220, which is not recorded in the deeds of the Abbots of St Albans, it's not recorded in the Chronica Maiora, we perhaps could be forgiven for thinking this is a sort of late-on obsession of Matthew's, but no. It seems to me that it's something that has framed his entire monastic life. How do we know about this on the 14th of May 1220? We know about it because it's recorded in Trinity College Manuscript 177. In the last 10 leaves, which have not been studied by scholars because they're not in the M.R. James edition facsimile, and they've only been available to us since last summer. But there it is. And it does seem to me to complete the jigsaw of what fires Matthew Paris's enthusiasm and inspiration. So how does this further relate? There it is. There's the entry. This, for those of you who quite understandably might want to check my bona fides, so this is folio 73, recto, column A. And there you will find it. I'm in the kind of company where you will have already translated all of this. But there you are. It is the second Ides of May, which, of course, everybody in this company knows is the 14th of May. So there it is. So how does this help us further to understand Manuscript 177? What I'd like to suggest is if we return those final 10 leaves, which I will begin to tell you a bit more about, into the frame through which we look at this extraordinary book. What they do is help to complete, I think, an understanding that it's a book intended to be a compendium of the cult. The cult of both Alban and Amphibolus, the co-patron saints of the Abbey Church. Why? one of the observations that grows on one the more one reads Matthew's writings especially, but has been rather, I think, absent from the way that scholars have responded to the book and to the illustrations and the lives of Alban, is that St Albans Abbey and its monastic community are deeply anxious about this cult of co-martyrs. Alban had failed to find any resonance with the Anglo-Norman rulers of England after the conquest. St Albans had not won royal patronage. Anglo-Norman kingship was evidently more interested in other cults. They cultivated interest in the cult of St Edmund, king and martyr, at Bury, much to the frustration and chagrin of the monks of St Albans. The selection of Lives of Alban and the material on Amphibolus that lies at the back of the manuscript are intended to draw together material, visual and textual, which can underline the status of the cult. In particular, to address the weaknesses of the cult as the monastic community understood it. Alban's fundamental problem, and probably the main reason why the Anglo-Norman monarchs show little interest in the 12th century, is that he's not English. He cannot be situated in a line of English monarchs. He lies in a remoter antiquity. And so part of what the collection in 177 is aiming to do is to articulate the alternative claim, which is the primacy of Alban. He is proto-martyr. And one of the assertions made at the back of the manuscript is to elaborate on Alban's claim to be Britain and England's Stephen, the first Christian martyr, but for the Christian community within England. They're also anxious in the monastic community at the long absence of royal patronage. They've not known royal patronage in a significant way for their church since before the Norman conquest. Equally, and we see this, I think, in the texts and the images combined in 177, they see an opportunity to emphasize the cult's connection with the Roman Church. And this is where the figure of Amphibolus, the co-martyr, proves especially important, because the backstory that is created for the co-martyr before he is martyred in Verulamium is that he is discovering his Christianity and his priesthood in Rome itself. So Amphibolus is a way of connecting the cult to the Roman Church itself, which from the monastic point of view is a way of ensuring that the cult can compensate for the lack of status that seems to resonate with the Anglo-Norman monarchy. So the book is clearly designed to articulate status and to address some of those anxieties. It's also intended to model how the cult is curated and performed at the Abbey. Matthew's illustrations do emphasize the environment for devotion to these two saints, and the shrine itself is pictured. The great and the good showing interest in the relics and the shrines is emphasized. And through the texts themselves and the accounts of those who have received intercession at the shrine through their acts of devotion, underline the extent to which there is ongoing potential, that this is not a static or moribund cult centre, but it is live, it is dynamic. If we add what we find in the last leaves of the manuscript, which have not been the focus of attention because they're not illustrated, we find texts devoted particularly to Amphibolus, which arguably are emphasizing yet further a feature of this cult which can aid its stand against those competing cults which the great and the good in 12th and 13th century England are showing stronger interest in. In particular, Amphibolus expands the scale of the cult at St Albans. Now, where there was one saint, one martyr, there is in fact not just two, not just Amphibolus, but his followers, who the texts tell us are martyred alongside him. What was the cult of a single martyr, which failed to find resonance with the new elite in 12th and early 13th century England, has become a movement. It's become a sacred space inhabited by a number of figures which can draw the attention of potential patrons as well as a new generation of devotees. So there is a particular problem that Manuscript 177, I think, is responding to. It is not simply a snapshot of a cult gathering together the history, the hagiography of St Alban and his shrine. There is something much more particular in its response to what, by the time this book is made, has been more than a century, really, of this cult standing in the sidelines, in the margins of devotional interest. The final leaves of the manuscript, which tell us much more about the cult of Amphibolus, also, because they tell us of Abbot William's translation of Amphibolus's relics to a new position on the 14th of May 1220, begin to help us to understand when this book is being made. If it signals another purpose, it also signals perhaps a more particular date. The texts at the rear of the manuscript on Amphibolus are the only precisely datable part of the manuscript. I'm not sure, and it would be great to hear if I'm completely wrong about this, I'm not sure that's been noticed fully previously. The account of the translation of Amphibolus on folio 73 recto column A is dated, but it's also written retrospectively, because it tells us that Abbot William of pious memory translated the relics. William died in 1235. So this part of the manuscript certainly is written in or after 1235. Seems to me that the emphasis in those closing stages of the manuscript and in these other elements is very much on responding to a wider social community that's showing relatively little interest in this cult. That changes in 1252. Finally, in 1252, the king whom Matthew met on the 13th of October 1247 and actually conversed with, the king comes to St Albans for a significant church festival for the first time in his reign. Henry III comes to St Albans for Easter in 1252. In a sense, my reading would be that marks the point at which Manuscript 177 has done its job. It has affirmed the alternative status of this cult. Alban may not be a royal saint, but he can claim primacy. There is a remarkable scale because of Amphibolus and all of his martyred followers. And finally, it does seem as if royalty is showing more of an interest than it has done before in the cult. So perhaps what we see is a book that is made between about 1235 and 1252, because it is undoubtedly reaching out to capture interest in the power of the relics, which would make sense after 1235, but not perhaps by 1252, when we see the beginning of a sequence of visits from the royal family, of closer interest in the cult. Food for thought, at least. So, just to underline why this book might be responding to a particular anxiety in the monastic community about the status of its cult, it's worth returning to Matthew's writings to know what's happening with the shrine, what I've rather glibly called the shrine horizon, in 13th century England. Shrines are active, Matthew tells us, in the first half of the 13th century all over central and southern England. He records miracles being reported at Bury St Edmunds in 1211, Dunstable, shown here in 1212. The relics of St Fremond are held there. Then a new cult emerging at Broomholm in Norfolk in 1225, where miracles conjured from the sacred Holy Rood that is held there. And then more, Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire, Ensham. And then the cathedral churches, where Matthew is assiduously attuned to miracles being reported. So not only are the St Albans monks facing a cult that has struggled to find a purchase on the horizons of the new Anglo-Norman elite, but other churches are claiming to have very active relics and shrines in the first half of the 13th century. It's very easy to see, I think, against this evidence, why Matthew's first abbot, William, in 1220, might want to produce a spectacle of his own by translating the relics of St Amphibulus. And it does seem as if Amphibulus is the focus of the monastery's reaction to this competition. What we might call a sort of second coming of Amphibulus. First of all, that translation in 1220. There is the shrine. The creation of an alternative centre for the cult, a satellite at Redbourne Priory, which is just a few miles away from St Albans Abbey, and it is where, allegedly in 1178, the remains of Amphibulus and his martyred followers were actually rediscovered. So now, again, St Albans trying to turn its cult not just from a single focus on one figure into a movement. There are now two cult centres. And then a series of miracles reported to advertise the nature of those who follow this cult. Always one of the purposes of medieval miracle stories, to demonstrate what manner of people might already be committed to this cult. The forms of devotion they engage in, and then the kinds of intercession that they receive. So how does this relate to those 10 overlooked leaves? Well, in these leaves, 68 verso through to 77, 77 verso itself is in fact blank, so it's 76 verso is the last of the leaves. We have a sequence of texts which clearly in origin were intended to be the direct counterpart to what we find in the opening part of the book with the sequence of illustrated lives of Alban and his passion. We have the invention of Amphibulus, so the account of the discovery of those relics at Redbourne. We have a fragment, and this is not noticed in Kolka's catalogue, a fragment of an account of Amphibulus's passion. We have part of the account of the translation of Alban, and then we have a series of miracles of Alban and Amphibulus. What's striking about this section is it is now just 10 overlooked leaves, but these have all been cut off. These are not incomplete parts of the manuscript, but now incomplete parts of the manuscript. And the text does just cut off. So they were intended to be a bulkier counterpoint to the opening of the manuscript. So they are now incomplete and interrupted. They're clearly retrospective. The miracles are unusually for a sequence of miracles. They are very datable because of the individuals they name and sometimes because of the dates they include. The earliest occurs within a year of the translation of Amphibolus's relics in 1221, and the latest is dated to 1224. So immediately after the translation, showing its effects. What's also important about the content of these is that these texts are all unique. They do not survive anywhere else. They are therefore an extraordinarily significant witness to a moment in time when the monastic community is responding to a growing anxiety about the status of its cult. Now, the appearance of miracles is striking because of the challenges surrounding the St Albans cult. Unlike many of the older Benedictine abbeys in medieval England, the monks of St Albans had been slow to compile collections of miracles. Elsewhere, we find miracle collections from the end of the 11th century onwards, and in large proportions. We don't find these from St Albans. As far as we know, there are two sequences of miracles of Alban himself. Miracles telling of remarkable cures and other intercessions happening to those who are devoted to the relics and to the shrine. One dates from about 1200, the other dates from the late 14th century, when the sequence of miracles is continued. We also have two sequences of miracles of St Amphibolus, one that appears to be transmitted alongside that first sequence of Alban miracles, and the other being in those last 10 leaves of manuscript 177. They are the only witness to that second sequence of miracles. From what we know of the script of part of those 10 leaves, and because of some other internal evidence, which I'll just highlight in a moment, it's a reasonable assumption that those miracles are the literary work of Matthew Paris. In which case, these leaves, that short sequence of 10 leaves, contains previously unnoticed original writing of Matthew Paris, which is another good reason for the digitisation. We have 9 miracle stories. The first, as I've said, dating from 1221, the latest dating from 1224. Matthew entered St Albans as a novice in 1219. These would appear to be records of stories that would have been current to him. Unusually for him, he doesn't break ever in relating these stories into the first person, but there's a reasonable assumption, because they're dated, that these were very close to him and known to him, or indeed told to him. As a novice monk of the monastery in 1220, he would certainly have been aware of the announcement of new miracles related to the translated relics. And there's the first leaf of the sequence of miracles. The miracles are a remarkable sequence because of their internal thematic integrity. They recount wondrous cures that have been visited on people in very similar conditions, and the experience they have at the shrine and from the power of the relics are all remarkably similar. And I'd just like to draw out some of those because I think they relate to the purpose of the book. The first feature is how far these miracles all relate to devotees to the relics of St Amphibolus, who had previously been devotees of other shrines, and who have been drawn to St Albans, finally realising the error of their devotional ways and coming at last to St Albans and to the newly translated shrine of Amphibolus. One comes from Cornwall, One comes from Derbyshire. Now, that's significant. Ashbourne in Derbyshire, which is mentioned in the miracle story, was one of the churches always to be visited by pilgrims who were on their way to Dunstable to the shrine of St Fremond. So here, Matthew, or whoever compiles the story, has a direct eye to their rivals just a few miles away at Dunstable. And the story is claiming, don't go to Fremond at Dunstable. If you're coming all the way from Ashbourne in Derbyshire, direct yourself, in fact, to St Albans and to the relics of Amphibolus. Another story tells of an individual suffering from chronic illness who first goes to St Nicholas in Exeter. Here it is, before realising that they should make their way to St Albans. Another, a husband and wife, a husband, Godfrey, carrying his wife Sybil on a pallet, comes all the way from Lynn in Norfolk to St Albans, having visited many other shrines. And then finally, we have a supplicant who visits first St Andrews in Fife and then comes to St Albans. Each time, each one of these stories is fixing its sights on rival devotional sites of pilgrimage. The rivalry focuses especially, as we might expect, on Broomholm. These stories are being written down after 1235, when that new cult centre at Broomholm was growing in popularity. So it's no surprise that one of the stories concerns somebody who had failed to find a cure at Broomholm. And in fact, the story, if it's Matthew recounting it, it might be because it's full of humour, because the custodian of the Holy Rood at Broomholm actually turns to the supplicant and tells them, you're wasting your time waiting here. I hear that you'll get a cure if you go to St Albans. So a glimpse into the mind of the monks, that they would like to think that even their rivals are in awe of the power of their relics. Another visits Cornish holy wells at St Ives and finds that the holy water there is of no curative property, and they come to St Albans. And then, as I've said, one has a very unsatisfactory experience at St Andrew. This is a pilgrimage badge of St Andrew at the cathedral there, and comes to St Albans instead. The stories also express the monks' preoccupation with whom they would like to be devotees of their cult. They particularly feature what we might call the political nation. The final, the ninth miracle story, the end begins on folio 77, recto column A, relates to Fawkes de Breaute, one of the barons of the region, and his extended family. And the supplicant in the story is in fact his niece, who suffers a very painful childbirth during the siege of Bedford Castle. And because of the trauma of giving birth during a siege, it's said that she becomes epileptic and only finally is cured by becoming a devotee of St Amphibolus. We also find gentry featured, and then the urban property, those who live in and around the town of St Albans. One of the supplicants is described as somebody who is born and brought up in St Albans. The stories are unusual because they even tell us, I've not seen this in any other miracle story from this period, from other monasteries. They actually tell us where some of the supplicants live. One of them lives here on Holywell Hill in St Albans, an older woman. Holywell Hill is significant as a choice for where a supplicant in a miracle story might live, because if you stand here and face that way, you see the east end of the Abbey Church. So residents on the hill just outside the monastic precinct are reminded also of the importance of the relics of Amphibolus. Another feature that all of the stories share is a particular focus on certain kinds of conditions that are to be cured by Amphibolus. Cancer, tumours, ulcers, and there are 2 of the 9 stories concern epilepsy. And there is a distinct orientation in the stories. women, older women, wives, young women, women in childbirth, as I've mentioned, children and adolescents. The woman who lives on Holywell Hill is brought to the shrine by a young man who himself, it is said in the story, had become a devotee of Amphibolus. The other feature they share is an awareness of Amphibolus as a saint, his particular capacity, and his real presence. It's not always the case in miracle stories of this period that saints become actors within the drama themselves. But in each one of these stories, Amphibolus steps out of his newly translated shrine and becomes a figure in the story. He appears as a giant, or a very, very tall man, and he speaks to all of the supplicants. He's of extraordinary stature. He appears in the garb of a priest. Again, here a reflection surely of the monastery's preoccupation with the otherwise somewhat nebulous status of its two patron saints. Who were they? Where did they fit in? We see more and more in these stories Amphibolus becoming a priest, a figure that supplicants can understand, a priestly sacerdotal figure with authority and with a willingness to act and to interact, to enter into conversation. His conversations with supplicants are recorded in these stories. He has what I suppose today we would describe as superpowers. Amphibolus takes one of the supplicants on an airborne journey. The supplicant at St Nicholas in Devon is lifted up from his sickbed and flown to St Albans to be shown the shrine. Again, I think a feature that is intended to underline the dynamism of this newly translated shrine. We learn a good deal about the environment in which these supplicants come to worship. This is the watching loft at St Albans. Possibly there was a watching loft also looking over the shrine of Amphibolus. The stories tell us a great deal about the material presence of the shrine and how the monks act as custodians. Even this rather sort of poignant, touching comment in one of the stories, story 7, that the monk who is looking after the shrine is consoling to the supplicant before they received their cure. And the stories tell a good deal about what the supplicants should do, that they are able to touch the reliquary directly with their fingers, it says. They can drink water that has dissolved within it powder from the stone of the shrine. All of the supplicants in the 9 stories, pass a night vigil at the shrine. They are also there to hear the monks performing matins in the church, in the choir alongside. And they all leave a wax votive commemoration, including the woman who is cured of a growth, a tumour around her eyes, who rather extraordinarily leaves a wax model of her eyes, it is said in the story. So, a sequence of miracle texts, and then that text that hasn't been noticed, which tells us a lot of Amphibolus' passion. As far as I can tell, this is another version of the Passion of Amphibolus, which does not pass into any other text. It has got details, including his actions in different parts of the country and in Rome, that are not found in other texts, and it tells us a good deal about his actions as a priest, as a prelate, and his preaching. But we just have 4 columns of that text, and that is there standing alongside the 9 miracle stories. So, those wonderful images of Matthew have tended to be regarded as aimed at a lay audience. But if we return these texts into our understanding of the book, perhaps we see a cult book for the custodians of the shrines and the relics themselves, telling us a great deal about their history, their identity, their primacy, but also perhaps especially through the miracle stories, explaining how custody itself should be enacted and practiced. Those gentle words that the monk shared with the supplicant, they're not there to be read by laity who will be looking at the images. That is an instruction, perhaps by Matthew, to his own community. It's clear that it is has a reception as a book within St Albans community. We do see the translated shrine of Amphibolus gaining traction. The sacrist's cartulary from St Albans shows that many new donations are made to the shrine in the second quarter of the 13th century, so perhaps as a direct response to the translation of the shrine. Amphibolus, the giant superhero, perhaps informs what the monks do next, which is to create an extraordinarily cutting-edge automaton which they stand by their shrines. We know about this from a 16th century description. It's still recalled in what they do at St Albans today. They make these giants on St Albans Day. But the 16th century description tells us that the automata were rather like this. And when the supplicant would approach and make their votive offering, the eyes would roll in the head and the figure would bow. Exactly what we see in those 9 miracle stories, in fact. So perhaps that's the first inspiration. The 15th century abbot, John of Wheatonstead, seems to know these Amphibolus miracle stories, but I can find no direct quotation. Likewise, John Lydgate in his English Life of Alban and Amphibolus. He knows some of that passion text, but he doesn't quote it directly. Likewise, John Leland, the antiquarian of the early Tudor period, and then Nicholas Harpsfield, the Catholic apologist in the middle of the 16th century. He does seem to know the miracles, and I wonder whether Harpsfield is one of the pairs of hands through which 177 passes. And then Augustine Baker, the English Benedictine of the early 17th century, part of the wider circle of Sir Robert Cotton, collector of manuscripts. Baker produces a transcript of the Alban and Amphibolus miracles. Now in Jesus College 77 in Oxford. Baker, I think, knows most of these texts. But it is a limited circulation, which is consistent with a book, one of whose principal motives, perhaps, was reaching out to the monastic community itself. So the overlooked leaves, I think, do help us to re-evaluate the purpose of 177. I think those miracle stories tell us about a strategy in a particular moment in time to respond to active shrines around St Albans and to the long-standing struggle of this abbey and its cult and its relics to gain traction. And that the monks were being informed of the identity and energy of their cult. And perhaps to be reminded of the central obligation of themselves as a community, and certainly the main preoccupation of Matthew Paris. I just want to end. I think there is something very personal that binds us to Matthew in those stories. We don't have, outside of his own self-portrait, very many moments where we learn something of Matthew as an individual and of his own biography, other than he entered the monastery in 1219, and it would appear that he is more active in the 1230s and 40s. But in those miracle stories, there is a bit of a pattern. The number of references to holy places, holy wells, shrines, cult centres in the southwest of England is very striking. One of those mentioned in one of the stories, in fact, as yet can't be identified. He mentions the holy well of St Cradon in Cornwall. He also mentions St Ives. one of the places in 13th century England where the surname Paris is most widely found in documents is in Cornwall. I do wonder whether, in addition to the other insights that those 10 leaves can offer, perhaps we have a clue to Matthew's own identity. Thank you.